from the novel. This is from chapter 4, and it is when Josephine Wright, she goes on her first little interview, her first little sleuthing mission to speak with the young lady who found the Harmons' bodies. Chapter 4. When Joe arrived in front of Angela Glasper's house, two men were sitting on the steps. They were both drinking coffee from styrofoam cups and smoking cigarettes. A small cordless radio sat between them, gospel music coming from its one speaker. A pack of 4 or 5 healthy-looking mutts emerged from under the porch, tails wagging. A welcoming committee, it seemed. Not a single one of them barked. They sniffed at her ankles. Their cold noses caused Joe to say, "Okay now, that's enough, get." And then they turned their attentions to one another. The men looked to be around Joe's age, but she didn't recognize them. That was for the best. Now wasn't the time for a schoolhouse reunion. Besides, what if they were a part of this crew who believed Limp would commit fratricide? "If you come for Jane's Rose," she said, "it's going to be another 15, 20 minutes or so," the slender, gray afroed man said, "and we both buying 6. Joe had forgotten that Angela's mother was a baker. Angela had mentioned it long ago when Nate had first introduced them, but Joe hadn't realized that Angela's mother made the baked goods right there in their home. She had assumed the woman did the baking somewhere else. "I'm here to see Angela," Joe said to the men. "She's in there. Go on up and knock," the heavy-set Baldwin suggested, his cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. Evidently, Angela had heard Joe and the men talking. She appeared at the door wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and a beige bathrobe. By the looks of it, she had been napping with her hand between her right cheek and the pillow. Her shiny hair was brushed back into a loose ponytail. It looked as though she'd recently had a relaxer. "Hey, Miss Joe," she said, opening the door and inviting Joe in. "I like your suit." The pantsuit was the least wrinkled getup in Joe's closet. She hoped the sneakers she'd thrown on toned things down some. Yes, Joe had every intention to ask prying questions, but she didn't want to look as though she'd come to ask prying questions. After taking a seat, Joe thanked Angela again for allowing her to stop by on such short notice. The mouth-watering aroma of baked goods filled the room. She might have come at just the right time to buy some of the rolls for Limp. She knew he was a fan. "No problem," Angela said. "Well, as you probably figured out, I'm out of work now. It's not like I have much else to do." Angela's mother, Jane, came into the room and introduced herself, though they had briefly met before at Manning's grocery. Or maybe it was at the flea market. Joe couldn't remember. Jane had a large afro picked out to a near perfection. And like Angela, Jane couldn't possibly weigh more than 100 or 110 pounds, Joe mused. Perhaps she was one of those bakers who never ate the product. "You can lay around another week or so," Jane said to Angela, "but then you need to get in your car and drive up Highway 64 and go put in some applications. West Mills Savings alone don't care nothing about whose boss died and left them without a job. West Mills Gas and Electric don't care neither." Many of West Mills residents worked in nearby Norfolk, Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach. Limp had commuted to Newport News 5 days a week when he worked as a foreman. That was before he was injured and went out on disability. "Ma," Angela sighed. "You won't find a job sitting here watching stories all day," Jane lectured. "I know that much." "Mama," Angela said, "you really gonna do this right now in front of company?" She rolled her eyes. Then it was Jane's turn to sigh. "Marion Harmon wouldn't shed a single tear for you. And, Ma, don't you have something in the oven?" Joe looked down at the rose-colored shag rug, then at the television. It was all the privacy she could offer the mother and daughter. She certainly wasn't going to suggest that she come back later. Too risky. Jo had questions for Angela, and she would be remiss if she didn't at least try to get them answered. Thank you.
Yay. Oh my God. I feel like that is the perfect excerpt to whet our appetites, both in terms of a narrative and those roles, which sound absolutely delicious.
Thank you.
But that's really what I love so much about the book, is that it is this edge of your seat murder mystery that I devoured like almost overnight. And it's also this like beautiful portrait of West Mills. I mean, it's this community that feels alive. Like, I mean, you can see it in that scene. Like these characters feel so lived in and so real. There's such specificity there that's so beautiful. And I also love how the book, it is this it works on the level of kind of a crime thriller, and it has that kind of addictive quality, but it also has a lot to say. There's real thematic depth in terms of what it explores with homophobia and racism, segregation, poverty. So it's a book that is working on a lot of levels, and that is a really tough thing to pull off. So congratulations.
Thank you. I hope I pulled it off. I hope it wasn't the kitchen sink.
No, you truly pulled it off. And I wanted to ask to start off, for those in the audience who don't know the premise, just kind of give us a little bit of the basic setup for the book. And then also if you could talk about what the initial spark of inspiration was for you to return to West Mills for this novel.
Sure. So the book kind of generally is about, there are a trio of siblings called the Harmons, Marion, Marva, and Lazarus Harmon. And they have been found murdered in their home by their receptionist. Marion is a pediatrician, although she treats adults as well. And their half brother, Olympus Limp Seymour, is being accused of murdering them because he has had this long-standing, feud, if you will. And recently, just, weeks before their murders, he was really spouting off at the mouth very publicly about them and very ferociously. So when they turn up dead, he's the community's #1 suspect. His fiance, Josephine Wright, she has recently moved back from New York City. She was born and raised in West Mills. She's been on a trip, and she comes back to find out that the Harmons have been murdered and that Limp is the prime suspect. And she loves him, obviously. They are planning to be married. He is in his late 50s, she's 60. They're ready to start a new life together. She has had, a tumultuous romantic life, and Limp is like the first man that she has felt connected to. And so she needs for him to be innocent, so that she can have him. And as she goes about trying to exonerate him, she starts to find all these dark secrets about various people in the town. And she learns things about Limp as well. And it makes her have to question, am I defending a man who might actually be guilty? And I think one thing I forgot to mention is that the authorities don't care who killed the Harmons. And that's part of the reason why she has to take it upon herself to exonerate her fiance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm sorry. The sort of kickoff moment for this novel actually came from a family function some years ago. It was before the pandemic came here or hit. And one of my aunts asked my mom, she said, do you remember when those 3 old ladies died in the canal? And like, do you remember what year it was? And my mom said, yeah, that was somewhere around 75, 76. And my brain was like screeching tires. what? Three women died in the canal at the same time, because I had never, of all the different stories I had heard my mom and her sisters and brothers talk about from their childhood and just things that happened. I had never heard that one. And so I was like, wait, three at the same time? How? And so they drowned in the canal. They were three women who what do you call it? Carpooled to church every Sunday. And when they were all in the car backing out of one of their driveways, the car somehow went into the canal. No one, to the best of my knowledge, knows what caused that to happen. I think we're just kind of assuming her shoe got caught on the ignition and she couldn't get it off. Something like that must have happened, or brakes or something. But anyway, they went into the canal and they drowned. And because this part of the canal where she lived at, the woman who was being picked up, is a section where people are constantly passing, and there's a little bridge right there. People saw it happen, and from my understanding, called help is right away, but it was too late, so they did perish. So anyway, I became really, really fascinated with that story and wanting to know as much as I could about those three people. And I even asked my mom if she would go and talk to some people and get well, I didn't ask her. She actually volunteered to go and talk to people to find out exactly what year it was. And she remembered a little bit about one of the ladies. One of the ladies was a hairdresser. But I said, don't do me a favor. Don't do too much research. I said, maybe if you can go get the year, that'll be helpful. But because I wanted to build my own story around it.
Yes.
I wanted to use my imagination. And I thought if I got too much biographical information, then I just didn't want it.
Yes.
So anyway, that's where it came from. The idea came from. But when I began to write, I decided to change them they were three white women. And so I decided to change them from white to black. And then I changed them from three sisters to two sisters and a brother, and so on and so forth, and created careers for them and all of this. And so that's that's kind of where it started. And it was not originally going to be a murder mystery at all. It was going to be an accidental death, just like it happened in real life. Eunice's, Savannah's, and Ted's sections were going to be pretty much as they are. But when I started to write, I was not feeling excited. I just wasn't. It was too quiet of a book for me, and I was like, I have to do something to wake this thing up, because if I'm not enjoying it, my reader might be bored, And so it was 2020 when I was doing like the really, really sat down and got serious, and was locked down and doing a combination of watching TV and reading and teaching on Zoom. And I was watching a lot of stuff that I grew up watching, like Murder, She Wrote and Matlock, and
Murder, She Wrote, love it.
And all the crime detective shows, Mayor of Easttown or whatever, Eastwood, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I said, you know what, damn it, I'm going to turn it into a murder mystery. And then I was like, but wait, 3 murders? And I was like, yeah. So
yeah. I love that. I mean, and I love, I mean, in my own work, I played with genre. I love how you play with genre, and it does kind of, there is like a tradition of amateur sleuths. Like for me, when I was like a kid, I would read Agatha Christie novels and like Miss Marple, who's like also like an old lady in the community, but like knows all the gossip and is trying to figure out that crime. What I also liked about your book, though, is that it does work on a deeper level, I think, than a lot of crime thrillers do. I feel, like where, Miss Marple is often seen collaborating with the police. Joe is out here because the police aren't doing their job. And they're ignoring this murder because it takes place in a Black community. And I feel like even though your book is set in the 70s, this problem resonates today. It feels very familiar to, I'm sure Black, queer, trans people whose lives are ignored
Yeah.
by the police. And Joe really steps in and takes charge and seeks justice, and also for the safety of her community. So I guess talk to me a little bit about, I guess, that aspect of the book. And, Joe talks kind of multiple times about how she is doing this because no one else will.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of, when I started writing, I knew that I would tackle topics of race, but I really didn't know that I would go in so heavy. And I didn't really plan to, and didn't even realize I had done it until I was like rereading a draft, like after I got to the end the first time and was going back to the top. But after I realized that race was a very big piece of it, it occurred to me, I was kind of like, well, of course I would. George Floyd's murder only happened a few months ago, from when I was sitting down to really seriously write. And just everything that happened from June 2020 up until, and so it's no wonder that stuff was filtering into my writing. But I think once I became conscious of it, and then I kind of wanted to double down, and I wanted to point out how often Black people are murdered, or sometimes it's less dramatic. Sometimes people are just hurt or injured or robbed and stuff like that. And how the authorities are just like, well, if it's not a famous Black person, we don't need to make a big deal out of it. And if it was if it happened in a Black community, that's Black on Black crime. And so what do you want us to do? And
Right.
They're just ready to close the case and move on to the next and eat their donuts, and so that is, as you mentioned, that is something that has always happened, and so I think I wanted it to stay in the book. I didn't go and pull any of that out because it's still happening. And I just kind of like sometimes to point out, it's sad, but how little things have changed. I mean, yeah, things have changed over the past 40 years for the better, but so much is the same. So much is the same with race relations and how law enforcement view people of color, in general. Like if you don't live in a fancy neighborhood, if you don't have anything to offer the county, who cares? Who cares who killed you, who robbed you, who beat you? Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like that was handled so masterfully in the book. And I feel like there's so much in this book that feels, again, it's a period piece in the 70s, but it feels like it could happen today. And I feel, I wanted to talk about also the way that kind of homophobia, without giving away any details, the way that homophobia kind of also is something you explore, in particular, homophobia and Christianity and how those can kind of go hand in hand. This is something that I've explored in my work as well. And it just struck me how much Christianity in the church, it's a background role, but it is an important role. Like, it does play an important role in this book, because I think it also depicts how the church can turn certain loving relationships into toxic ones.
Absolutely.
It can tear families apart, and people can behave in ways which they think are well-intentioned because they're doing it in the name of religion, but they're actually doing incredible damage. So I guess talk to me a little bit about what you were thinking in terms of the way that religion is depicted in the book, and homophobia, and kind of your thought process behind that.
Yeah. Before I mention that, I want to just do a quick plug for your book, because Jonah, I read Jonathan's book I read it in 2020, I think, because it came out. I think I may have the times wrong, but anyway, I was really taken by Jonah's story, coming from a religious household and having to set himself free of that oppression, for lack of a better word, and it just thrust him into New York City. And doing things anyway. That your book stuck with me a lot. It really did. So folks, pick up a copy of Yes, Daddy. I know that title is really provocative, but as is the cover with the man floating in the pool. But let me tell you, it's not all roses and swimming pools, and you know.
That's true.
So, but anyway, I wanted to make sure the reason why I had the homophobia part be heavily religious is because I think that's sort of the root of homophobia, you know, even among people who aren't even religious. I think homophobia is largely based on it's wrong, you know, but why is it wrong? And you know, so I wanted to, that's why I have, and I'll just, this is a slight spoiler. That's why the moment when Eunice approaches the doctor and says, I got this problem at home and I think you can help me with it because you're a professional and all this. I wanted that moment to happen in the church, you know? It's kind of like a drug deal, you know, or you know, or worse. It's like arranging something bad in the house of God, you know?
No,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah. And so that's why I remember when I first wrote the scene, it wasn't going to happen in church. It was going to happen out in the community. And then I thought, no, to show this, how deep it is, how deeply people feel about homophobia and how it's tied to religious beliefs, I was like, it has to happen in the church. You know, this scene has to happen in the walls of the church. But yeah, I just wanted to shine a light on homophobia, and that it can start really early in a queer person's age. You know, Leroy is 14, but you know, that's kind of generous. Children who are presenting as queer earlier are having to deal with homophobia inside and outside of the home, and that is something that I wanted. I just had to point it out, you know. And it can cause them to act out in ways that they would not normally, because you're basically, the child is basically being told the way you are is not good. You know, you are not good. You are bad. And what do you do with information like that? You know? So yeah, I wish I could say more, but there's no way to do it without giving all the circumstances.
No spoilers. But that idea kind of also ties into the title in a way. I mean, I love the title because there is this kind of winking irony to it. Like, obviously the book is about murder and decent people don't murder people. But I also think it works on this deeper level because there are lots of secrets in this book that many people harbor, and lots of horrible things that people do to each other, whether it's based on homophobia or based on racism. But in so many of these instances, people think they're doing it for a good reason. They think that they're doing it because it's the decent thing to do, yet this kind of well-intentioned violence comes back to haunt them. How did you arrive at the title, I guess?
So the title is not my brainchild. I can't claim credit for it. The book had another title originally called Pharaoh's Army, and that was based on a scene where Limp is having a conversation with his mother. That scene still exists, but I shortened it, and she had referred to the Harmons as Pharaoh's Army. And so when I went in and revised that scene, the phrase went away, and I couldn't figure out a way to get it in there somewhere else organically, you know. And so I emailed my editor and I said, well, we got to start thinking about titles because Pharaoh's Army isn't going to work anymore, you know. And so I pitched 3 or 4 very clunky titles, but he was able to analyze them and find that commonality in them all. And he said, I think what you're getting at is that these people are like, they do bad things. They think they're for a good purpose, like, all the stuff you just said. And then he said, let me think on it. And he came back with decent people. And I said, sold. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about returning to West Mills, because obviously the book is a standalone book. And you can read it whether or not you've read your first book or not. But as someone who's read the first book, it reminded me of, like, I love making marinara.
Okay.
And the longer you keep your marinara on the stove, the deeper the flavors get, and the more compelling the sauce tastes. And it made me think of that. It was like, oh wow, we're returning to this town, and the flavors are deepening. I'm seeing new people, but I'm also seeing some of the same people, but through different lenses. And it just feels, it made me just feel like this is a town that I live in. Do you know what I mean? Like, but I'm seeing it from so many different vantage points. So talk to me about what it feels like to go back to a setting, what you found challenging about it, how you decided which characters you wanted to see again.
So the main reason I chose to do it in West Mills again was because once I decided that I was going to use Eunice, Breezy, Leroy, I said, well, either I'm going to move them to some other town, or I'll just use West Mills again, And so that is the primary reason. And then the whole piece about what I learned from my family about the drowning in the canal. And since I wanted to, even though I wasn't using the canal anymore, as an accidental drowning, I was like, oh, I'll just leave it all. I'll leave it all there, But it was fun returning to the town. And I thought, okay, I have to, it's the 70s. And in West Mills ended in the 80s. And I couldn't quite remember what setting details I had added, for at the end of that novel. But I had to sort of back things up and say, okay, mention the things that might have been there in the 70s that weren't yet there in the 80s. But and so it did take some brain work to okay, what chains were even around in the 70s and that sort of thing. But it wasn't hard returning to that town. And I think it's largely because the town is so closely based on the real town of South Mills, North Carolina. And I know that town like the back of my hand, So all I had to do is just like think about the roads and the streets and stuff. And I changed the names of streets and roads and lanes and that sort of thing. But I can see that place. I can see it so well. Yeah. And every time I go home, I drive in it for at least 5 to 10 minutes and just look at the places where it's my actual real hometown. When I was born, South Mills is where I was taken. That's where my parents lived at the time. And then they moved, and then they moved to Elizabeth City. I may have been a year or two old. Yeah. So
I mean, yeah, you can see it. I mean, when you say like you can see it now, but like you also do such a good job of having us see it as well. Like even in the scene you just read, like I mean, I'm also like, I just love sweets and baked goods. So like I was from the big girls, but like there is, I mean, like I said earlier, there is like this, you just feel like you're dropped in and these people are living their lives off camera, off the pages of this novel. Like, but like the guys waiting on the porch, like, Angela and her mom, like it's like you sense that there are lives that these people are living off these pages, even though you're not seeing them, and you're just dropped in a specific moment, and it's just like, it's amazing.
I don't know how to, when I say I mean in that I don't know how to do it any other way. I grew up in a community where just about everyone worked, and everyone worked unless they were unable to, unless they were in some kind of way disabled. And if their job wasn't outside of the home, they babysat, they babysat 5 kids 5 days a week, or there was all people worked, even the old ladies worked, you know. And so I don't know how to write without that being in it, you know, and I don't feel like I have to draw a lot of extra attention to it, because I think it's just, I try to make it clear to the reader that everyone has a job and
Yeah.
everyone goes about their day doing normal things, and you
Yeah.
know, and that's
Yeah.
why murder shakes things up so much, you
Yes.
know.
Yeah, exactly. I want to ask about also the decision to do shifting perspectives, which can be a very challenging thing to do from a craft perspective. Yeah, why did you choose shifting perspectives? Did you find it challenging? Did you find it easy? And how did it help in terms of hiding certain secrets or revealing certain secrets? Yeah, just tell me about shifting perspectives.
So once I decided to make it a mystery, I did have a brief moment of thinking maybe I should stay with Joe the whole time, right? And it would just be her. She would be just interviewing for the whole novel.
Yeah.
And there was a moment where I was like, that's fine, you know, that's fine. And then I thought about it and I was like, no, I'll get tired of being with Joe and just her snooping around and stuff, and asking people questions. And like, would we be able to get all the information we needed fully from her point of view? Because people aren't going to say things when they're trying to hide things, you know? And so I came to the conclusion that I had to keep the roving POV perspective, that it was necessary. Um, I would say in terms of, you know, maybe who was easier or harder to write, I think that and Savannah and Ted, I had to really pay attention to what I was doing with them. And I think for obvious reasons, they're white, you know, and um, and what I wanted to make sure that I was not doing is I didn't want to, where Ted is concerned, I could have easily made him just a one note racist 59, 60-year-old with a lot of money and privilege and
Yes.
all that. Could have easily done that. But I thought, no, I don't want to do that. I want him to be problematic, but I also want him to have a cross to bear, you know.
Mm.
And his cross is that he really doesn't have anything of his own. I mean, he owns all this property and he has like all this money, but it's all handed down from his father and then his older brother. And so I wanted him to want something. I wanted him to want a respect that he has, but he doesn't feel it because
Yeah.
he didn't earn it himself, you know.
Yes.
And with Savannah is largely a good character, but I realized that she was too perfect. You know, she was too perfect. A white girl who grew up in a racist home, and but she was not racist, and she met a black man, loved him, married him, had kids with him. And then I thought, but she can't be perfect, you know.
Yeah.
And so I won't spoil, but that's when I gave her some problems, you know. But I those were the two that I think I felt like I had to pay extra close attention. That
Yeah.
I didn't want to do a stereotypical thing of just making them like mean white people in a small southern segregated town. You know,
Yeah.
I definitely wanted to give them something special to themselves. The other two, you know, Joe and Eunice, because I sort of have practice with writing not, you know,
Yeah.
they were not like hard to write.
Right.
You know, they
Right.
weren't, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, all the characters have such incredible depth to them, and like you're saying, I do think the perspective shift allow, because you see certain people and you're like, oh, that's just like the old racist white guy, which is what I first thought. And then to your point, like when we shift into his perspective, it's like, oh, okay, he's an old racist white guy, yes, but he also is a human being. You know what I mean? Not that you're excusing that in any way, but like,
Right.
but there's, you acknowledge everyone is a human being in some way.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to do. Because I don't believe that anyone, I was just telling someone last night that I don't believe any human being is 100% evil. And I think that if they are, it's probably due to some sort of mental illness. Who can be 100% evil? Just like no one is 100% fabulous and great. You know what I mean? And so I try to do that with all of the characters, white, black, you know, no
Yeah.
one's perfect. Everyone, when I first sent PJ this draft, he said to me, he said, one thing I like about this novel is that everyone is complicit. No one is perfect in this novel.
Yes.
You know, I mean, Joe is probably the most decent of them all, but you know, she's snuck around with a man she was working with, you know. So.
Yes, totally. I mean, this is just something an interesting. I loved. I mean, maybe love is the wrong word, but gossip is such a huge part of this. I mean, everyone loves to gossip, and there is like a quote, like I forget who said it, and I'm gonna butcher the quote, but that like good novels read like gossip or something, like, but there is this element of gossip and people talking in the book that I just it was like, it's like, but it also is really, it's more than gossip because it's valuable information. So it's like, on the one hand, it can be negative in terms of it leads people to accuse the wrong person of murder, but then also it's kind of used, it's the pieces that Joe has to put together this puzzle.
Right.
I don't know. Do you like to gossip?
Yeah, in a fun, in a fun, light way. You know? Wink, wink. But I think the reason why gossip is so important to this novel is because it's the way information, like you just said, it's the way information gets passed around, and it's for Joe to figure out what is true, what is false, what's been embellished, and, because she's not going to get information from the horse's mouth, so she has to go and talk to people and nudge, and did you hear this? I heard that, and it works. It works. But I do think, I think we can all agree that gossip is not good, right? But it serves its purposes, and especially in fiction. It serves its purposes.
And it also, just like from a craft level, like you just want to read gossip. Like when people are like divulging a secret, like, I don't know, it kept me on.
Exactly.
As a narrative device, it also just keeps you on the edge of your seat because you're like, well, yes, bitch, I want to know the tea.
Right. One of my teachers, Ethan Kanan, he says bad behavior books. He has these rules, and he's like, stories and books and novels should have bad behavior because one bad action leads to another action, good or bad, but it leads, it's a domino effect.
Yes.
And so I took that gossip is bad behavior, and I make sure I took that lesson and I ran with it. Yeah.
I love it. I think we're getting into Q&A time. If there are any questions, do we have any cues from the audience?
We do have some questions. Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you both. Deshawn, thank you for the wonderful reading at the start. And Jonathan, thank you for your great questions. It's been great to just hang out and listen to the two of you. Two questions, yes. So the first one is from Erica, who starts with a nice compliment. Erica says, there's such musicality in your dialogue. Is this innate, or did you have to work specifically to develop your ear for it? It's a two-parter. What does your conversation writing process look like?
Dialogue comes to me easily, and I think it's because I grew up around excuse me, I grew up around talkers, and so all I do is just think about conversations I've heard and conversations that I have. And yeah, dialogue, I write dialogue first, as a matter of fact. I get that on the page first, and then I go back and fill in the exposition. Yeah. So my first draft of Decent People, like the very first draft, was double the size, double the length, because it was just pages and pages of dialogue. And then I go back in and I convert some of that to exposition. And yeah, so dialogue, maybe I won't say innate, I'll call it learned, but learned at a young age, Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. And also that's fascinating. I don't know. I mean, I may have spoken to people who do start with dialogue, but I don't know that I've ever heard anyone say that they start with dialogue in that way, and that they then chip away, that they then convert dialogue.
It's a tip from a friend, Regina Porter, the author of The Travelers. She is a playwright. And at one point, I think I was telling her that I was struggling with, I was trying to start a story, I think. And I was like, I always have trouble trying to write the exposition. I just want to dive. I hear the dialogue first. And she said, well, that's not a problem. She said, that's what playwrights do. And she said, write your dialogue first. Don't try to do exposition. If that's your thing, do that first. And she can go back. She said, you can go back and talk about what they felt and what they wore and what they moved, how they moved and all that. And so I let go of this feeling that like prioritizing dialogue was somehow wrong, Yeah.
Well, and certainly not, because that's what that's what draws me in most often, really, when I'm reading, and good dialogue jumps out and sticks with you, because it doesn't always happen. And there are, you read books that you might like very much, but the dialogue doesn't necessarily stick. And so getting that right, I think, is just particularly engaging and memorable, and those lines stick out to you. Jonathan, I feel like something about writing dialogue as well. If you want to, I'll invite you to talk, because that was a great piece of advice about shifting into sort of playwright mode, right?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that is an amazing, I mean, you can tell from the way that you write that the dialogue does feel very real and lived in, and I feel like that really comes across. So I am not surprised to hear that. I think for me, my first drafts are similarly, I think speeding over like some of the details is helpful in a first draft. I don't know. I don't necessarily have like a specific trick when it comes to dialogue. But I do think it's about kind of like what you were saying, Deshawn, about like what helps you get it out on the page. I just need to like write continually and just not worry about it being pretty. And I just need to kind of like tap into the flow. And some days I'll be like, yes, I am feeling it. This will show up in the published manuscript 2 years from now. And other days I'm like, wow, that entire chapter will go in the garbage can. But I think the most important thing for me in those first drafts is finding that, and just plowing through, kind of like you were saying, Deshawn, like for you, it's like just doing all the dialogue and just like letting it flow, like to try to find that flow state where you're just really, powering on through, just to keep the momentum of the novel going and to get that first draft out. The first draft is the hardest.
All great advice for the writers that are with us this evening. Thank you. Our next question is from Monica, who asks, how was the experience of writing Decent People different from writing in West Mills?
It was different since there was a plot point that I had, a plot thread that I had to carry through to the end. I had to make sure that every chapter, because when I started to write, when I moved into Eunice and Savannah and Ted and was going into their histories and the stuff that they were dealing with internally, and just even in their little nuclear families, it could become very easy to forget that there was a murder investigation going on. That they may or may not be complicit in. And so I had to make sure, don't forget that there's a murder and that you have to bring it up and that these victims have to be brought up in every chapter, and that this lady, Jo, is snooping around and might be on their heels. So I had to, that was one of the challenges, was remembering that. And also because of the murder mystery element, pacing was definitely a challenge for me. I was tipping my hand too early sometimes, and then there was other times when I was withholding information that probably should have been given in chapter 3, and I didn't say it until chapter 7. And so my editor, Daniel Lodell, he has had some experience with murder mystery. And so he was able to catch that stuff that I would have never. Editors are great, editors are great because they have an eye for things that we as the writer, we have our messages that we want to get across and stuff, and we forget the minutia sometimes. So pacing and making sure that the plot didn't drop off. I wanted it to take a back seat, to the novel because the social issues are more important to me, but I didn't want it to drop off, the plot to drop off.
Yeah, great. And it certainly doesn't. Jonathan, you said it so well at the beginning that the Decent People accomplishes so much. It hits on so many levels, and the murder mystery is certainly one of them. Thank you.
Yes.
And the next question is actually for you, Jonathan, who, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, but Vasilona says, I read Yes, Daddy, and asks if it is loosely based on a true story.
No, it's not. It is based on a true era of my life. I will say that. It is definitely pulled from when I first lived in New York City. I was in a milieu which is very similar to that's depicted in the book. I worked in a gay restaurant that is similar to the one depicted in the book. I dated, for all the wrong reasons, a lot of much older, powerful gay men. And so I do think there was a lot of soul searching I did through fiction in terms of looking back at my 20s and the ways in which I felt powerless and the ways in which I did things for perhaps all the wrong reasons. But it is not autobiographical, to make that very clear, and not about any one particular person. So yeah, but I mean, as Deshaun talked about earlier, I find it always helps to have, obviously they're very different books, but he is pulling, in West Mills, he's pulling from something real. For me, it helps to pull from something real. And then again, like Deshaun mentioned, with the elements of these 3 women who died, you take it and the novel becomes its own thing, and it becomes its own reality, and it becomes its own universe. And oftentimes it can move from very far from your actual lived experience, or it can stay pretty close, but regardless, it gets turned into fiction, and therefore it's not a memoir, I could say, although it might be able to tell more truth than a memoir, if that makes sense, because you're able to capture maybe the kernel of your experience without getting bogged down in the real life details.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Truth, if not facts.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
yes, that is
Yeah.
it.
I
In
like
fiction,
that. Truth but not facts.
and
Yeah.
fiction really does that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good fiction really does that. Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Barcelona, again, forgive my pronunciation, has a question for you, Deshawn, as well. Deshawn, which scene stuck with you the most or was your favorite from Decent People? If that's something you have an answer to or can answer without spoiling, obviously.
Hmm.
You might not be able, sometimes it's hard to pick favorites.
Yeah. I think my favorite scene of the book is probably there are a couple that kind of play around in my brain. But I think one of them is when Joe goes to visit the Burris couple and um the wife T, she tells Joe some stuff about limp, and it forces, Joe is kind of like, well, yeah, I know some of this already, but when T adds something new, well, here's the thing that I bet you didn't know about, that scene for some reason sticks in my mind. I'm not even sure why. Maybe it's just because it was a tension, a moment of tension when she's just thought, okay, my man is fine, he's innocent, and then here comes this lady with more, with something else, So that's one of the scenes. If I say I can't list another one because it will spoil. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has to do with that church scene that I mentioned earlier. I'll say
Yeah.
that much. Yeah.
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 So just a reminder to folks to just pick up a copy of this book at your local independent bookstore and read it, because it keeps you on your toes, and it's great. And so Krista, I didn't forget about you. You just asked the perfect question to wrap up on. So Krista's question is, what are you working on now? So I will pose that to the both of you, if you're able to talk about that.
Cool. Jonathan, you want to go first?
Sure. I am eyeballs deep in my second novel. Deshawn and I actually have the same agent. And at the beginning of the month, I just met with PJ about our agent about notes on the first draft. So now I'm in the second draft. But it feels much less daunting than the first draft. So yeah, working on my second novel right now, and hopefully we'll take it out to publishers sometime in the spring. However soon I can get my act together and we can get it out there to the marketplace. How about you?
Nice. Nice. I have just recently decided what the third novel was going to be, because I was playing with a few different ideas, and some of those ideas I was like, well, maybe they are actually the same book, but I finally landed on something, and I'm sticking with it, and I'm really excited about it. And what I will tell you is that it will be set in the 80s, and probably the late 80s, and I'm going to change the setting. I'm going to set West Mills aside for a while, and I'm going to use a real life town. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
we Jonathan and I both were like, oh yeah, all right, we're here for it. That's great. We're really looking forward to everything that comes next from both of you. Thank you. And Deshawn, congratulations on this new novel. It's wonderful. And Jonathan, same to you on all of your success with Yes Daddy. And we really are looking forward to what y'all produce next. And I will just invite both of you, Jonathan, why don't you go first, and then we'll end with Deshawn to just share any final thoughts you would like to this evening before we say goodnight to the audience.
I mean, my final thought is pick up a copy of Decent People the minute you will. Just plan on not sleeping that night, because we're going to be staying up all night trying to figure out who did it.
Page turner is so overused, but it actually applies. Just saying.
Thank you. My final thought is, yes, please buy a copy of Decent People, buy a copy of Yes, Daddy, order them from Malaprop Books online. And thank you all for coming out. Support your local, or not local, but support your favorite independent bookstore and read. I would say watch less TV, but then I'd be a hypocrite because I'm going to watch TV.
Yes, thank you for not saying that, because yeah, I'd have a problem there too. This has been so great. Thank you both so much for being with us this evening. And thank you to everybody who's been with us this evening in the audience. We so appreciate your time. We look forward to seeing you however, whenever, wherever in the future. And please stay safe and well in the meantime. Good night, everybody.
Good night.